As I mentioned in my most recent video, the transfer window is less than 3 months away, and given all the uncertainty around our club with the sale, we cannot afford to waste any time in looking for the right players. I think it's pretty clear to most Manchester United fans that we need midfield reinforcements given that McTominay, Fred, and Van de Beek are not good enough to be in the starting 11 and probably should be sold in the summer. And also the likes of Zidane Iqbal, Kobbie Mainoo, and Hannibal Mabry are still developmental players who perhaps need a loan to the championship to play 40 games a season before they can start getting first team minutes. So today, we're here to identify what we're missing in the United midfield and which midfield signings would address these issues this summer. This analysis is going to be heavily focused on per 90 stats, so I hope you guys came prepared to look through some numbers. As always, don't forget to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy, and don't forget to turn on all notifications to never miss out on content just like this. Now I have to admit, I was initially going to make this video as a two-part series where in the first video I would compare the best Premier League midfield trio to Bruno, Casemiro, and Eriksen to identify what United is missing in midfield, and then in the second video I would go through the stats of the potential midfield targets to understand with complete certainty that these are the players that we need. But in the interest of time, given that we have football coming back in the next few days, I decided to do all the research for the first video offline and show you guys just the stats and analysis here so we have at least a brief idea of the type of players we should be looking at this summer. So here are the 3 statistical categories we'll be comparing across the 2 midfields. First, the goal contributions per 90, which includes actual and expected goals and assists. Shooting and passing stats per 90, which includes shots, pass accuracy, touches, and progressive passes, defensive actions per 90, which includes tackles and interceptions. And to compare United against, we're going to use City's starting 3 of De Bruyne, Gundogan, and Rodri as the benchmark because in my opinion, they've been the best, most balanced midfield in the Premier League over the last 3 years. So here are City's stats across our 3 categories, and I have some key observations from each category. From the first table, notice how their starting midfield contributes to only 32% of the team's overall goals and assists, but they contribute to 41% of their expected overall goals and assists. This 9% discrepancy points to the fact that goal scorers across that City team are better at finishing their chances. From the second table, notice how the City midfield takes only 30% of the team's touches, but plays 42% of their progressive passes. This indicates how the ball moves forward whenever it gets into the midfield. From the third table, notice how City's midfield contributes to about a third of the team's defensive actions per 90. So keep all of these observations in mind as we look at United's midfield stats. Here are Bruno, Casemiro, and Eriksen stats across all 3 categories. Immediately, you'll notice a trend emerging here. The United midfield contributes to more goals, shots, touches, and progressive passes per 90. And to a small extent, they do more of the defensive work for the entire team as well. And you might think to yourself, wow, that's great, and it means that our midfield is better. But if you take a second to dive deep and really think about what's happening here, you'll come up with the following observations. 1. We're too reliant on our starting midfield to score and assist goals because if they're contributing to 46% of our goals, it means the rest of the team, including our bench, aren't doing enough. 2. We are too reliant on our starting midfield to progress the ball forwards because if they're making almost 50% of our progressive passes, it means the rest of our team, including our bench, aren't really progressing the ball forwards enough. And number 3, pass accuracy is an issue, not just within our midfield, but throughout the whole team. And my 4th and final observation is that our defensive output is completely out of balance. If we look at the City midfield, their CDM contributes to about 50% of their defensive output, while the number 8 does 30% and the number 10 does about 20%. If we look at the United midfield, Casemiro, our CDM, does 58% of the defensive work, which is too high. Bruno, who's supposed to be our number 10, does about 30%, and Eriksen, who's supposed to be our number 8, does only 13%. So you can see how things are kind of out of whack there. So taking all of these stats into consideration, I have the following suggestions for Manchester United's transfer department. Number 1, we need strength in depth in the midfield. So we need reinforcements for all 3 positions because a balanced midfield doesn't drop off a cliff when you rotate 1 or 2 of the starting players. Number 2, we need those reinforcements to be good passers of the ball. And I mean, the backup CDM should have at least a 90% or above, the backup 8 needs to have 80% or above, and the backup 10 can be around 70 to 75% as long as they're good at creating stuff just like Bruno is. And number three, both the eye test and the stats we've just seen tells me that Eriksen is not supposed to play in the double pivot next to Casemiro. He's been doing a job there for us. So we need a starting 11 player that can play next to Casemiro and do the offensive things that Eriksen can, but also contribute defensively so that Bruno can focus purely on the number 10 role. Keeping all of this in mind, let's look at two midfielders that I've selected for each position that can potentially solve some of these problems for Manchester United next season. We start with the number 8 role because that's where we're looking for someone to start over Eriksen, and we're going to look at the same statistical categories as we did before, just this time on an individual basis to compare the current United player to the potential signings that we're looking at. So here are Eriksen's stats across these categories, and here are the stats of our first number 8 option in Orkun Kokcu from Feyenoord. Now, I've obviously done a video on Kokcu already, so go check that out, link in the description below. But as you guys can see here, he's just as good as Eriksen, if not better across most stats. His passing isn't in the 85% range where we'd like to see it, but that can improve. But more importantly, his defensive output is about 45% higher than Eriksen's, which will allow Bruno a little to focus more on being a pure number 10. Next, our second number 8 option is Kenneth Taylor from Ajax. This guy is flying well under the radar this season, as I don't hear anybody talking about him as a potential option. But as you can see from his stats, he's very similar to Kokcu, if not slightly better. He has more goal contributions, but his underlying stats are slightly worse, suggesting that over the long run, he won't necessarily create more than Kokcu. His pass accuracy is better at 87%, but he has a slightly lower volume of progressive passes, and his defensive output is almost 70% higher than Eriksen compared to Kokcu's 45%. Now, I'd be happy with either of these two to replace Eriksen in our starting lineup because I think we can get either of them for 50 million or less, but I'd personally go with Kokcu because that's just a personal preference. Next, we'll look at a backup option for Casemiro because it's probably where we struggle the most when our starting option is missing. And here we'll focus more on these defensive and passing statistics because we don't really care about goals or assists for a backup CDM. So here are Casemiro stats across these categories, and here are the stats for our first number 6 backup option in Manu Kone. And I know some of you would have wanted me to talk about Kone as a potential number 8 option, but in my opinion, he's just not good enough going forward, so I think he's better as a pure CDM. His pass accuracy is definitely much higher than Casemiro at 86%, and he has a similar volume of progressive passes per 90, but his defensive output across the board is much lower. Granted, he's just 21 and he has room to improve, but for a player that will cost more than 30 million to come in as a backup CDM, I'd like to see a little more development in his game before we actually go in for him. Now, our second option for number 6 is much more interesting, and that's Edson Alvarez. Obviously, Ten Hag will know a lot about this guy from his time at Ajax, and at 25, he's pretty much the finished article already. And we can see the evidence of this in his stats because he's better than Casemiro at his pass accuracy, progressive passes, and aerials 1 per 90, and he's slightly worse in the other 3 defensive stats. And the added benefit of getting someone like Edson Alvarez is that he can also play as center back. He plays there for Ajax in some games. So not only can he back up Casemiro at CDM, but he can also back up Rafael Varane at center back. This means that if we sell Maguire this summer, which we probably should, we can use Edson Alvarez when Varane needs a rest. And with 2 years left on his contract at Ajax, we can probably get him for about 40 million euros or so. So get in the comments below, who would you like to see as a backup CDM? Would you like Manu Kone, who's more of a developmental player, for about 30 to 40 million, or Edson Alvarez for about 40 million or so? And last but not least, we need a backup for Bruno Fernandes. And this is probably the most difficult position to look for because Bruno plays more than 95% of our games. So ideally, we'd look for a young attacking midfielder who needs a couple of seasons to develop, and our main man Enzo Lefebvre fits this description pretty well. Much like Kone, I know many of you might have wanted me to pick him as a number 8 option, but I don't think he fits that profile, so we're going to see if he works as a number 10. While his output this season is similar to Bruno's, his underlying stats are a bit lower, which is not a huge issue because we're not necessarily expecting him to be of Bruno's quality right now. It also looks like he's worse than Bruno at the rest of the creative stats that we've selected here, which is again fine because he'll have some time to get better at these things as he rotates with Bruno. And with just 1 year left on his contract, we should be able to get Lefebvre for 20 to 25 million euros. As our second option, we have a very interesting name in Houssem Aouar. A few seasons ago, this guy was touted as the next big thing in European football with links to Arsenal and PSG and some other big clubs across Europe, but it never seemed to happen for this guy. What got me particularly interested in looking at this guy as a number 10 option is that his contract expires this summer, so we can actually get him on a free transfer. And his output is very similar to that of Lefebvre, except the fact that he has more shots and progressive passes per 90. Now, he has missed 10 games due to injuries this season, but his injury history before that wasn't too bad. And like I said, we can get him on a free transfer, which means we have to pay just the signing on fees and wages for this guy, and he will be a backup to Bruno, not a starting option. So for this position, we have a very interesting dilemma. Do you pay 20 to 25 million for Lefebvre, or do you get Aouar on a free transfer? Let me know your preferred option down in the comments below. So after a very methodical approach to identifying the flaws in our midfield, we figured out that we need better depth and balance to ensure that we're a dominant force in all competitions next season. And we've also identified and analyzed 6 new midfielders, all of whom could improve Manchester United's midfield overall. If you ask me, I'd like to sign Orkun Kokcu and Edson Alvarez this summer for a combined fee of about 80 million euros, because Kokcu can start as an 8 and back up Bruno in the number 10 role, and Alvarez can back up Casemiro and Kokcu in midfield, while also be a backup for Varane in central defense. And in terms of outgoings, I would sell Donny van de Beek and Scott McTominay to raise at least about 40 million euros, which I think we should be able to do for those two players. And if we have a few million left over, I'd spend it on signing Houssem Aouar on a free transfer so we have tons and tons of strength in depth for next season. Get in the comments below with your thoughts. Did you like my suggestions for fixing the United midfield? Did I miss a player that you would have liked me to include in this list? Let me know your thoughts down below. As always, thank you guys for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.